Chapter 6 Harvest 879. The funeral procession took the route of the river as it flowed past them and towards the sea. The entirety of the royal court were with them, following the carriage on which the armory, possessions and body of the deceased King Findliath lay. Osrith walked with the servants. It was a chilly day. Tiny white flowers littered the short, well-trodden grass, narrowing as it found the lower undulations, and the wind tugged at clumps higher up on the hills. They had passed the town of the grassy water meadow where two rivers met, and they had all rejoiced at the cool, refreshing river waters where the horses watered. The last fortnight had been one Osrith would only ever see once more in her life. The body of the kin lay on a low bed in the as Queen Malmuir addressed the palace's household as women, cloaked in black, stood at the four corners of the low table, watching the body, emitting a primal wailing around the king's body. The wake would commence, Muir continued, over the wailing, from that moment, and that it was a blessing that, unlike her brother, king of the Picts, Findlech had died in his sleep. Morning found its way to the royal throne room, a weak sunlight, as if robbed, like the king, of its strength and might. Feasting followed, and lasted all day and into the night, for 14 days, as the Mabna poets exalted the king's exploits over the Leinster kings, those in Connacht and Munster, the Allied kings and the Norse. They told of his battles and reminded all he was the Ra-negation Dabail, the true king of all Irian, while all the while women around the king wailed. And now, they had passed Strabane, and were walking towards an Atildigme, to the monastery. It was still a good walk, Finolai told her, as she held the hands of her two charges, the two little princes. I'm hungry. Neil Gla tilde superscript Obdub squeezed Osrith's hand. As the wake had gone on, she had been given responsibility of the young prince, and his cousin, Malcolm, and they were now all walking, despite horses which had carried them most of each day's way, to honor the king. Me too, little Malcolm echoed, taking her other hand. Osrith drew them to the embankment, out of the procession, into a bed of clovers. Do not tell your mother, Osrith instructed to young Neil, nor your aunt, she added, to Malcolm. Both boys nodded in eager anticipation. Osrith watched as the warriors passed, making sure none of Domhnall's warriors saw her, and she removed a large hunk of bread taken at breakfast from her tunic. Splitting it between the two young boys, she watched two sets of jaws devour their shares quickly, and they were soon back onto the path. The monastery was in sight, but the boys were also tired, as well as hungry. They lingered back as Osrith tried to stride on to catch up with the warriors. When Malcolm slumped onto the grass with a big HMPH, Osrith went back and picked him up in her arms. At once, Neil began to scream at the unfairness. Come on with me, grubby knees, said Tadg, who evidently had also stopped for a short time. You can ride here, and I'll hold you. The tall, blond warrior swung himself up gently up onto a roan-coated mare, and put the deceased king's second eldest son up in front of him. Won't be long now, Tadg soothed, as the open plain stretched out before them. He held reins out to Osrith, who took them. He meant for her to ride, Osrith knew. Instead, she held the little boy to her hip, as she looked down onto the plain where they would next rest before traveling to the city where the ancient burials of royal kings, trailing the dappled white mare behind her. She was no rider, and it would not do to risk the life of the little prince, who lay his tired head into her neck. Osrith looked at the land. They were no longer in U-A-N-A-Diarus country, Tadg explained as he rode slowly next to them. This was Eguala. They were kings in name only, for they owed their allegiance to the U-A-N-A-Diarus foraid in their most recent battle against the Allied of the East. St. Patrick rode here, once, Tadg said to Neil Gla superscript own dub, who was also leaning back in tiredness. Do you know, he planted all the seam Ray cube G, all over here? Grubby Knee's eyes widened and Malcolm leaned over, listening too. How? The boy turned and put his pale grey eyes on the warrior. By walking over the land, Tadg smiled. God is 3 in 1, so he is, an Ather, Agusamic Agus Spy or Aidnaim. He leaned forward, with a young clover in his hand. 3 parts, in one, altogether. You are a priest, Tadg. Osrith smiled. Tadgluk turned his head and returned her smile. I can tell a story, the tall warrior acknowledged. My mother's father was a sinker. He could tell the old stories, from dusk to dawn at Mindwinter. Tad leaned towards her, lowering his voice. One night, he was invited into Scone, even though he was Gaelish. His eyes flashed with merriment. King Drest wanted him to entertain him and the nobles, who were meeting there. While they waited to meet Sainid Mac Alpin, they thought the king of the Gaels wanted to sue for peace. Well, Tad shuffled Neil into a different position. Drest listened to my senior as he feasted, relaxing, with the other 6 nobles of Pitland, to the tales of battle and honor through the ages. Yes? Asked Grubby Knees, beginning to become enthralled. As they drank, continued Tadg, his eyes sparkling in the summer afternoon sunlight, the Gaels, led by Domhnall's grandfather Senid, waited for them to be blind with the drink. Then, he pulled bolts from the benches, which he had spent a long time assembling, trapping the Picts with their king in pits in the earth, in them contained with deadly blades. And so, now, he added brightly, the Gaels rule Pitland. Ruled, Osrith murmured, as she frowned at Tadg's horrific tale of treachery wrapped up so lyrically. This is the cause of the uprising by Eochaid and Girik. You are very well informed, for a servant, Tadg nodded. I am very underarmed for a warrior, Osrith remarked, feeling, once again, the loss of Feda sword, as her thoughts drifted to the possibility of escape back over the sea again. You tell your tales well, Tadg of the Gaels, she added, remembering that her mother told her always to thank the storyteller, or they may lull you under a spell, to your doom. You will get another sword, Tadg replied. And by your arm, you will make it as good as the last. Osrith laughed at the warrior's words. They were indeed beguiling, soft like a bed of clover on a summer's day overlying tangleweed, bidding you to your own comfort while binding you path of its own. I'm still hungry. Little Neil yawned, and then leaned into Tadg's chest. He smiled down at Osrith, as he made the horse canter, to catch up with the other warriors. Osrith looked down to little Malcolm, he too was asleep. And that night, exhausted with the journey as she lay on the bed of straw in the stables alongside Domhnall's other warriors, Osrith's dreams would be filled with a Cumbraland Britain, holding up a small clover plant and enchanting the pagans with understanding of God. 88,888,888. The procession marched on. They headed southwest. This time, their destination was clear. Up from the plain of green grew one large hill, and upon it, where once had been a hill fort, said to be the burial place of the goddess Maca, was St. Patrick's Monastery. Ahead of them rumbled the low cart, still watched over and wailed over by the mourning women. The monastery was their destination. It would be here that the body of the mightied Findlaith, High King of the Irish, would be laid to rest, at the most holiest of locations in the lands of the Ua tilde negation na tilde Diarus Sicil. Late the following afternoon, as she rode with 2 tired boys at the back of the kitchen cart, she watched Domhnall as he began walking with the royal group around the path that would take them up to the monastery. He had barely spoken to her since he had pulled Constantine from his bed on the morning of Findlaith's death. His eyes narrowing with disapproval as Osrith, too, had sat up in his cousin's bed. Osrith knew that, even if she was not really one of his warriors, and however informally she had given it, she had gone back on her word. What's more, his warriors knew there was something amiss. She had displeased the exiled heir to the Pictish throne, somehow. But she could not approach Domhnall now, much as she would remake her vow to him. Osrith had felt she needed Constantine's closeness after their attack. So, she had to learn to be strong, to strengthen her feelings towards the boy now that he wasn't a boy but, at 13, a young man. And, for this young man less than 3 weeks had passed since the news of Tmac-Tildelpin's murder at the hands of the usurpers, Eochaid and Girik, his father. If he was feeling anything like Osrith had felt, when she was made aware of her father's death on the battlefield, and the loss of her mother to become her aunt, then he would feel as if the sky and ground were pressing her, and she would climb and crawl, and find somewhere high and solitary in Bibbenberg, to feel the strong east wind rush through her hair and over her skin. God spoke to her there, as he spoke to those blessed of saints. Cuthbert, Aidan and Chad all remarked that the forces of nature were divine communications. They were revered by the Saxons as well as the Northumbrians and, in the case of Aidan and Chad, in the heathen lands of Mercia too, last to stake their eternal life on Jesus Christ. Yet, there was something heathen about attributing natural phenomena to the Lord's doing. Kings did not proclaim that they looked for weather omens, even if they really did, and yet these men were, as saints, deeply blessed to sainthood, believing little more than heathens did. Osrith learned, one night in the barn with Fergus, Finlay and Tadg that Domhnall did not intend to challenge the throne, but remain with Constantine with their kin, this kin who was now on its way to the remarriage, for the sake of dynasty, of their aunt to another negation Diarus Cecil king. Osrith looked again on the Dowager Queen. Malmuir had walked as if she were floating behind the carriage of her husband, silent and still as she paced, in a blue cloak, her dark hair glowing richly as it caught the summer sun. The Gospels need to be completed in the monastery of St. Patrick, Muir had told her, before they set out, and she gave the two young princes to her care. Only those who had been trained at Ardmacca may spread the Gospels. She had bent close to her ear, and whispered, "And the ink you collected will go to finish these Gospels in this most sanctified of our places." Findlay was put to rest early next morning. Osrith was woken by Fergus before dawn and told to wait with his other warriors outside the monastery doors. A cool wind blew her hair as the king was carried out on a bed covered with a silk cloth of red and gold. Domhnall, the king's eldest son, held the front right corner at the back. Domhnall. Next to Domhnall, a young man, as tall Domhnall, but broader, with the same fiery hair as the man at the front. He was undoubtedly a king. A circlet of bright gold sat in amongst his bushy red hair, and he was undoubtedly the dead king's relative, for he stooped to Carid's body level with the other three men. In fact, he was so big, Osrith thought, that he could have carried the body of the king himself. The funeral procession strode slowly to the front of the monastery, where Muir stood with Mary, Gormleth and Era, with Neil and Malcolm in hand. With the warriors, behind the monks, Osrith walked behind the body of Findlaith. Constantine fell in next to them, his face solemn, his pale face even paler. He had not slept, Osrith guessed. She thought about what she had promised herself and resisted the urge to take his hand. "We, Domhnall and I, are not really the Irish king's relatives," Constantine said, softly. "Once the king is buried, we travel with Aunt Muir to Tara, and a festival will be called." He pointed to the man at the front of the body, who had indeed shouldered the king down, standing him upright, in a suit of armor. Only he could have managed that, Osrith thought, given how large Findlay had been. "Who is that man?" whispered back Osrith, as the procession of cows given by the peasants lumbered behind. They were going to be slaughtered after the burial. "Flansinna. He hopes to be made High King of Ireland. The nobles must vote. He is who Aunt Muir is to marry. He is already King of the Southern negation Diarus Cecil. That will go in his favor." Very shrewd, Osrith thought, on both their parts. "Will he be king in the north?" Constantine nodded. "He hates the Norse, wants to force them out. If he becomes High King, he might have the combined force to do that." Then Constantine walked slowly over to the royal group, and stood between the tall Gormleth and the spiteful Mary, who turned her pale eyes upwards to him. Osrith drew her eyes back to the burial, and watched as Findlay was lowered into his grace. But not lengthways. Flansinna had moved his body into the grave, a long, upright grave, and into a standing position. Around him, Muir passed Flan pieces of what looked like armor, a bowl, pots, a clay pipe, several highly decorated drinking cups made of animal horn, a checked gaming board and the king's weapons. Last to he lowered in was a bag of coins. "And they say Ireland is a Christian country," Finolai hissed. to Domhnall's warriors. "If the monks weren't here, it would look to me for all the world like a pagan burial, especially with the 8. "He's looking east, isn't he?" Fergus protested. "Northeast," Tadg put in. "That's the direction of Ollade territory, sure?" Finola mused, catching Domhnall's eye. Osrith saw the weight and the damned Norse. 88,888,888. A feast was held in the monastery that evening. Osrith, for once, was gifted a seat with their warriors. Meat was shared. The cows who had followed Findlache's body had been butchered. At the royal table, Muir called for words to be spoken of for her husband, toasts to be made, ale to be poured. Domhnall looked so solemn, Osrith thought, as she imbibed a little ale. The princes had been taken from Osrith and were asleep in the monastery, the royal servants watching over them. Constantine, sitting next to Domhnall, also looked sore, bitter, and he was deep in conversation with Domhnall. They had something in common, Osrith guessed, as she discreetly excused herself and made her way to the stables. Both had lost their fathers, and both their fathers had been kings of ancient lands. Osrith had made part of her way across the stony courtyard of St. Patrick's Monastery, the evening still underscored by a streak of yellow, when voices drew her attention. She stooped behind a low wall, listening. "And I tell you once again, Don Chada, if you do not know where the Queen is, then neither do I." A shuffling of feet suggested someone was struggling against someone else. Osrith craned to listen. "You, treacherous insect. I know you work for my conniving father." More scuffling. "If you have lain one finger on her, she was not your mother," the antagonistic voice retorted. "Your mother was Gormflaith of the Ollade. Flann turned her over for Ethne. And does Muir know? Does Domhnall? She's his sister, his true sister." Was he standing by and allowing it, to ingratiate himself with a future dynasty? "Ethne is my own cousin, as Domhnall is. Muir educates my dear sister, Gormlaith." "You don't think?" The voice stopped suddenly. In the darkness, Osrith could feel a flush on her cheeks. It was her foot that had rested on loose stones, her fault that they had scraped, alerting the two men talking in whispers that they were being overheard. She ran, kicking more stones as she went. Behind her, stones were kicked again. Through the monastery garden, now in seed and being cleared, over tools and beds. Osrith launched herself at the and scrambled up it, her arms feeling weaker than they usually did as she hung onto the wooden framework. "Damn the ale," she cursed herself, as she scrabbled higher. She got up a little higher, but her leg was wrenched down. She kicked out, her foot impacting on skin. Ahead, she was guessing as the owner growled in pain. She swung up, but her nails clawed at the wood, rather than grasp it. Osrith fell, landing in a heap on someone below. Hands grasped at her legs, her ankles, as she fought to escape. Another swift kick brought her out of reach and up into an apple tree. Osrith climbed high as the commotion below. "We have you now," a triumphant voice below bellowed, as feet crunched on the tree detritus below. "And it will soon be morning. I have a sword." Osrith closed her eyes. It was true. When she climbed down, everyone's eyes would be on her. Guilt swept over Osrith as she imagined laughing eyes, mocking eyes. Eyes which belonged to the UA tilde negation NA tilde Diarus Cecil and the monks and the children. Eyes belonging to Domhnall, to Constantine, narrowing in disappointment and shame. Osrith made a rustle in the tree canopy, and triumphant feet stopped pacing. She would come down, as best as she could. She would apologize in the morning. But she found she could not go down. Her feet could not find purchase, and her head swam. She climbed up, apples thudding to the ground as she went, over and over, making her way to the other side of the tree. But, Osrith found, there was no other side of the tree. No branches dipped down towards the ground. A strip of paler blue underscored the night sky. Should she call down? Osrith carried on, tired arms gripping branch after branch. As the morning drew on, and she grew ever wearier, it occurred to her how big the tree actually was. But, she was wrong. When, finally, she looked around, it was in astonishment. She was at the top of a tree canopy. But not the same tree as she had climbed. that had been the one on the other side of the wooden wall of the monastery. Osrith realized she had climbed between dozens of trees, into the wood they had passed on their way into Street Patrick's, the one which half surrounded it, so high it was in the landscape. With great care, Osrith extricated herself from the branches of the tree she was in, her body weight stretching at her tendons as she climbed. The door to the kitchen was pushed aside when she got to the north side of the monastery. An voice unintelligible to her shouted as they heard a noise. It was the irascible cook, who was almost indistinguishable from the one in the kitchen at Doya. He bustled her in, shouting something angrily at Osrith, which she couldn't make out, then thrust a bowl full of dirty root vegetables at her. Tired, though grateful, Osrith turned a knife onto them, making them, in no time, into chunks that became the servants' dinner. 88,888,888. They travelled to Kells, or Sinanas, as Tadg said it, as Domhnall told his warriors the next morning, and onwards they would be travelling to Tara. The royal family at first, in front, with the children in a carriage, Domhnall in front, with his stepmother, and ahead, Flansinner, with his son Donchada, who had had a heated conversation 2 nights before with someone, and had chased Osrith up the tree. Osrith had to manage on a horse, which was as bumpy and uncomfortable as it had been when she had first tried it in the meadows surrounding Scone. It took all her concentration to balance, to keep up with the warriors. She glanced, every so often, over to Donchada, wondering what he had meant, and who Ethan was. She, who was in some sort of danger. He had also called his own father conniving, yet he rode adjacent. The king of the southern negation Sisil impassively, long, dark hair flowing out from his head, pale skin and grey eyes, a match for Domhnall and Constantine, strong gaze searching the road ahead. They want to proclaim the new High King of Irion, Finolai explained, as they packed up the horses. Flansinner seeks the position, as well as Muir's hand to seal the deal, and take Tara with both the southern and northern kingdoms. But it isn't that straightforward. Others will contest, and the lords must vote. It is called a thing. Like a Witten, Osrith thought, as she strode to the rooms of Queen Muir, who would have her take charge of the boys again. She knew what a Witten was. Father Bicker had explained that the nobles in Wessex and Mercia agreed in their kings, but not in Northumbria. Uhtred had held the fortress for many an age, right back to Ida, the first from across the sea to claim the headland overlooking the sea from the northern Britons, and had taken a Brittonic wife. Osrith looked across to Finolai. She wanted to ask him about Domhnall. The prince looked worn, as if his spirit had been slowly draining over a long time. Maybe, though, if the conniving father of Donchada, Flansinner, did become High King, he may offer Domhnall aid to retake his throne. An alliance of some kind must be being worked through. Or why were they still in Iran now find Leitch was gone? It took 2 days to get to Kells, once a new negation Sisil palace belonging to Comsil. Now, a monastery founded by his Ionian monks. It could not have been more different to Street Patrick's. Indeed, St. Comsil's monastery, as the royal family called it, was made of stone, and not wood, and the round tower which rose high from its centre could be seen for miles before the procession got to its sturdy walls, and had once been a royal palace. As they got closer, the way was marked with Irish crosses, those type with a circle at the centre, uniting the heathen sun worship with that of the symbol of Christ Jesus, the Redeemer. It was between 2 such crosses that Osrith took Neil and Malcolm, as she looked over the land. Were they close to the sea? Osrith wondered. Were there heathen here who might welcome a warrior, albeit without a weapon, to protect them if they were travelling, say, over the sea, maybe boat to Cumbraland, or Wellies? Though she had found her way to King's Court in Dunnottar, and could easily fall in with Domhnall's warrior, Osrith reminded herself that despite this life, her main objective was to find her brother, for she knew her uncle Alfric would never give up looking for her, for she was of value to him, and it must have angered him greatly that she had defied him. Flexing her arrow-damaged hand, she approached the two boys who had again been put in her charge. Neil was playing with an ash tree branch, trying to defeat an oak tree a little beyond the round oratory where the monks slept. Little Malcolm sitting by him, using his stick to make patterns in the leaf litter. A little illicit bread taken from the monastery's kitchens an hour before tempted the two royal princes to abandon their games and sit next to Osrith, who smiled at their eagerness where food was concerned, before taking them up to the rooms that the royal family were occupying. The rooms were wide and spacious, the stone walls covered in highly decorative hangings. "They are as old as Comsil himself," Muir told her, as the boys ran to her. Osrith felt herself pink in the cheek as she realized how lost in the thread detail she had become. The queen was a sight to behold. No longer in black, she wore a blue dress, her dark hair flowed long over her shoulders. Her eyes were bright, she had done her mourning, and now, like a flower opening up its petals to the warmth of the morning sun, her face was alive with girlish hopefulness. She might be the older sister of Gormalith, maybe no more than 20 years old. She explained to Osrith that there would be a declaration of her marriage to Flansinna, and that the southern negation Diarus Cecil had met and accompanied him and his son down to Tara, where they would meet them for the wedding. "Is it by the sea?" Osrith asked, for by the sea meant heathens collecting its fruits. "Yes," Muir nodded. "And I wish you to be in charge of the boys," the beautiful queen continued, taking Osrith's hands, as lightly as a girl in her first days of courting might. "And, you will wear a dress, as befitting your sex. I know you are my nephew's warrior, but I must put my household to rights. After the wedding the Diarus Cecil will hold our festival, and one such as that has not been held for many a year. Festival. A parley. A meeting of all the Diarus Cecil families, and our allies." Muir sighed and straightened out the material on her bodice, before crossing over to her son, Neil, and taking him in her arms. Malcolm looked up, wide-eyed, and the queen put down a hand to him. "We have been at war with the Norse for so many years that the annual festival has been suspended. It is held every 7 years, or, at least, it was. New laws and duties are ordained and councils are formed. Anyone who has been convicted of breaking laws is formally banished. Sometimes, the High King chooses to be lenient. Should there be the need for a new High King, he is elected." Muir sighed, remembering. "The last time it was held was when my father brought me over the sea to be married to Findlaich. The Norse have been subdued and have settled. We are at peace now, so we can meet as we always did." "It does not mean it will stay peaceful," Osrith thought to herself, grimly. Northumberland, Lindisfarne, Pitland. They all thought the same, and the Norse and Danes returned, and it got worse. Instead, she nodded in agreement. "I am sure your future husband has a plan to keep the peace," Osrith added. Muir's carefree look vanished from her pale blue eyes, and she narrowed them towards Osrith. "You understand well," she said. "My father discussed this with my brother, and with me. To gain peace it must be belied with strength and might." That was what he said. It wasn't necessarily a lie, if father meant Bika, who had indeed voiced her father's words. "Yet, your father lost his life as a pilgrim on his way to Iona." Osrith lowered her head. "Indeed, lady," she replied. Muir put her hand softly under Osrith's chin and raised her head gently. "Look," Muir said, stepping towards a low table. "Here is what your effort Haddles brought us." She leafed over the pages and showed Osrith the leather-bound pages of the half-completed manuscript that Domhnall brought from Iona. The pages were brilliant, in gold and red, richly illuminated with the 4 apostles' names in the Irish script, framed with the Gaelish swirls of the Sra, unending chains, animals and ancient symbol of the Lord, a right hand of God, stained with iron oxide pigment. It was as if Osrith was looking into heaven itself, made clear to man in parchment and pigment. "Glorious, is it not?" Muir said, placing the book open on that page. "The monks here will continue with it, and will make it into a much larger book and use it for their rituals and to preach to the heathens. And I cannot let your efforts go unrewarded. Now, I have a role for you. I know Constantine will not be without you, but you can continue being his companion no matter what you wear. I have spoken to Domhnall, and he agrees for you to continue to care for the two boys and the girls. Osrith thought of the three princesses who would lead the way each morning from the castle to the monastery, silent, obedient, perfect in their studies. Era, the beautiful, young golden fair girl who was never parted from the nervy, ever watchful Gormalith, Don Shada's sister. The black-haired, big-eyed Mary was the one in charge, though, or thought she was. They are in my care. Oh, Mary. The girl had walked into Mia's rooms. Neela MD Malcolm rushed to her, but the girl held aloft the fabric she was holding to prevent it from being creased. She held it out to Mia. Osrith had never seen anything like it before. Cream linen with a silk bodice, beautiful pearls embroidered at the front, with ribbons at the sleeves and waist. Do you like it? I like it, Osrith nodded, looking at the way the light bounced off the silk. But I am the daughter of an artisan, I cannot accept this. Nonsense. Mia rebuffed her, looking about her head. Your golden hair down, combed down to show your maidenness, and you will be glorious on my wedding day. So, shall I leave you with Mary's help? Help, my child, it is a dress I wish you to wear. As Constantine's companion and the prince's assistant, she is more than able to help you make the nest of a poor artisan's daughter. Mia gave one final glance over her shoulder, one of approval, then took the boys by their hands, pacing towards the rear door, through which Mary had come. Osrith's head shot back to the dress, and then to Mia. You wish me to wear it? She looked over the dress again, ashamed that her first thoughts were of disappointment that she would not be able to keep the company she liked, nor ride, or fight. Yes, indeed, Mia nodded, as she continued in her outward momentum, boys still in hand. Mary, show Osrith how it goes on. But Mia was not listening, and, within seconds, she had whisked herself out of her chambers. Osrith looked at Mary, who was looking back, scathingly. Aunt Mia said to bring this. Mary sniffed, haughtily, although, if you ask me, it is a waste. And Era, the girl broke off, as if she had said too much. No one asked you, retorted Osrith, as Mary's face pinked. Pass me the wasted dress and leave.